I was never supposed to find that box. It was late autumn in Virginia, and the air in my mother's attic felt like dust and ghosts. The funeral had ended just 3 days earlier, but his scent still lingered on every folded uniform, every medal case, every forgotten photo frame. My father, Captain Robert Lang, U.S. Army, Vietnam War veteran, was gone. Everyone who spoke at his memorial used the same words: hero, patriot, legend. But none of them knew how quiet he became when the lights went out. None of them saw him tremble when the fireworks started on the 4th of July. I did. And that day, when I lifted that worn, wooden box from the corner of the attic, I felt it before I even opened it. That cold, invisible weight that only soldiers recognize, the kind that smells like unfinished business. The latch broke easily like it had been waiting to open. Inside was a folded flag, a letter sealed in yellowed plastic, and a Medal of Honor with his name engraved. I froze. He'd never mentioned this medal, never once. He already had a silver star, a Purple Heart, all proudly displayed in his study. But this one, hidden, tucked away like a secret. The letter was bloodstained, old enough to crumble when I touched it. The writing was faded, but I could make out just enough to feel my stomach twist. To whoever finds this, tell my daughter I kept my promise. I couldn't save them all, but I saved one. Don't let them rewrite it. No signature, just my father's shaky handwriting at the bottom. And the date, March 19, 1973, the week he went missing behind enemy lines. For most of my life, I believed my father was unbreakable, the man who taught me to stand tall, shoot straight, and never back down. He was the reason I joined the army myself, to wear the same uniform, to carry the same purpose. But that night, sitting cross-legged in that dusty attic, the truth hit me harder than any battlefield I'd ever been on. There was a story buried beneath that medal, a story my family had never told. I went downstairs and found my mother in the living room, staring blankly at an old war photo. Dad in fatigues, arms slung around another soldier, both smiling under a burning orange sky. When I asked her about the medal, her face went pale. "Where did you find that?" she whispered, voice breaking. "In the attic." "Why didn't you ever tell me about it?" She shook her head slowly. "Because that medal wasn't supposed to exist." She wouldn't say more, wouldn't look at me, just whispered, almost to herself. "He made a promise in that war, sweetheart. Some things are better left buried." But I was my father's daughter, and if there's one thing soldiers can't stand, it's unfinished missions. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind rattled the window, and every creak of the house sounded like a whisper from the past. I stared at that medal lying on my nightstand. The ribbon frayed, the gold dull with time, the engraving shimmered faintly in the moonlight, for uncommon valor in the defense of others. I thought about that phrase, the defense of others. Who were the others? What promise had he made that haunted him so deeply he had to hide the proof of it? I remembered when I was a kid, asking him what the worst part of the war was. He didn't talk about the fighting. He didn't talk about the fear. He said, "The worst part isn't what you see, it's what you're ordered not to see." At the time, I thought he was being poetic, the way veterans sometimes are when they can't find the words. But now, those words sounded like a confession. The next morning, I went back into the attic with a flashlight. I searched every box, every file, every drawer, until I found a military journal tucked inside an ammo crate. Most of the pages were blank, but on the last one, there was a note written in ink so faint I had to tilt it toward the light. Lang, Operation River, promised the child safe passage. They said no one survived, but the truth must stay hidden. Operation Riverlight, I'd never heard of it. Not in any official military record, not in any book or documentary. It didn't exist. At least, not publicly. I felt my chest tighten, because I knew what came next. If the mission wasn't on paper, then someone had buried it. And if my father had hidden his Medal of Honor, the country's highest award, that meant it wasn't earned the way it was recorded. It meant the story, written on his gravestone, a hero who gave everything for his country, might not be the truth at all. I stared at the medal again, then at the blood-stained letter beside it. "Tell my daughter I kept my promise." I whispered it aloud, over and over, until it didn't sound like words anymore, just a heartbeat from a man who carried too much. And in that moment, I made my own promise. I would find out what really happened in Vietnam, would find out who the child was, and I would uncover the truth my father spent his whole life trying to protect, even if it meant rewriting everything I believed about him and about the country we both served. because sometimes the only way to honor the dead is to finish their unfinished war. Growing up, my father was more myth than man. In our small Virginia town, everyone knew the name Captain Robert Lang, the decorated soldier who came home from Vietnam with scars on his skin and medals on his chest. He was the man who stood tall at parades, whose uniform always looked pressed even decades after retirement. To the world, he was the embodiment of discipline and dignity. To me, he was the father who taught me to tie my boots before I could spell my name. When I was little, people would stop him at the grocery store or after church. They'd shake his hand, call him sir, tell him he was a hero, and every time, he'd smile politely, nod, and say the same thing. Heroes are the ones who didn't make it home. I never understood why he said that so often, or why his eyes would drift somewhere far away when he did, but I do now. As a kid, I used to sneak into his study when he was out back working on the truck. There were framed medals on the wall: Silver Star, Bronze Star, Purple Heart. Each one represented a story he never told. What stood out most was the empty frame, the one with no medal, no certificate, just a small plaque that read Operation Riverlight, 1973. At the time, I thought it was just something he never got around to finishing. Now, I realize it wasn't empty by accident. It was a silent reminder, a ghost he refused to hang on the wall. When I was 17, he took me shooting for the first time. It was late afternoon. The field smelled like pine and gunpowder. He handed me his old M16, the one he'd carried in Vietnam. The metal was worn smooth, the stock polished by time. Asterisk, he said, "There's one rule you never break, kiddo. You only pull the trigger when you're ready to live with what comes after." Back then, I thought it was just a lesson about aim. Now I know it was about conscience. That day, after we packed up, he sat on the hood of the truck and lit a cigarette. He wasn't supposed to smoke. Doctor had warned him about his lungs years ago. But war habits die harder than soldiers do. I remember asking him if he ever missed being in uniform. He exhaled a slow cloud of smoke and said, "Every damn day, but not the way you think. I don't miss the fight. I miss the purpose." That sentence shaped me. It's why I enlisted 10 years later, to find the purpose he talked about, to stand where he once stood. I thought that would bring me closer to him. But now, the closer I get, the more the ground shifts beneath my feet. At family dinners, he never bragged about the war, never told stories about firefights or medals. When people pressed him, he'd steer the conversation to sports, fishing, or the weather. But sometimes, when the room went quiet and Mom went to the kitchen, he'd stare at the fire like it was showing him something no one else could see. One night when I was 8, I asked him, "Daddy, did you ever kill anyone?" He didn't scold me for asking. He didn't answer, either. He just looked at me for a long moment and said softly, "Sometimes, doing the right thing doesn't feel right. Remember that." I didn't understand what he meant until years later, when I was deployed in Afghanistan, and I saw what right looks like in the wrong kind of light. When he passed away, our town honored him like they always had. Full military funeral, guns salute, flags lowered. People I hadn't seen in years showed up to pay respects. Old war buddies, local officials, even a senator who'd once used Dad's photo in a campaign ad about American heroes. They all said the same thing. He gave everything for his country. He was the best of us. He left a legacy of courage. But while they spoke, I kept thinking about that hidden medal in the attic, and the blood-stained letter that said, "Don't let them rewrite it." Because maybe they already had. A week after the funeral, I went through the boxes Mom hadn't touched in years. Old uniforms, faded photos, yellowed documents. One picture caught my eye. It was from the early 70s. Dad stood with a group of soldiers in front of a burned-out village hut. Behind him, half hidden in the frame, was a little girl, barefoot, staring straight into the camera. Her expression wasn't fear, it was recognition. Someone had scribbled on the back, "Lang Riverlight." I felt a chill crawl down my spine. I'd seen that word before in his journal, on the last page. Operation Riverlight, the mission that didn't exist. And now, the girl who wasn't supposed to be there, was right in his photo. I showed it to Mom, but she wouldn't even look at it. "I told you," she said, trembling, "leave it alone. Your father carried that guilt for 50 years. Don't make it yours now." But it was already too late. Because I could feel it, the same pull he must have felt when he made that promise, the same ache that never left him. That night, I lay awake replaying every word he'd ever said about honor, truth, and duty, and I realized maybe hero wasn't the right word for my father. Maybe he was something rarer, a man who did the wrong thing for the right reason, and carried the cost in silence. When I closed my eyes, I could almost hear him again, his gravel voice, steady and low. Never dig too deep into what you don't understand about war. But I'd already started digging, and what I was about to find would tear apart everything I thought I knew about my family, my country, and the kind of promise that can outlive a man. The army taught me how to keep secrets, but not how to live with them. That week after the funeral, I couldn't stop thinking about that word, River Light. It echoed in my head like a coded message, like something my father had left behind for me to finish. So I did what any soldier trained in intelligence would do. I started digging. I had access to military archives through my service. Nothing high clearance, just standard post-deployment records, but I knew how to read between redacted lines, how to see what wasn't there. When I typed Operation Riverlight into the system, the screen blinked once and returned no results, not classified, not restricted, just nothing. That was worse. Every real mission, even covert ones, leaves a paper trail: mission dates, call signs, casualty logs, logistics chains. Riverlight had none, which meant either it was erased or it was never meant to exist. Still, something in me wouldn't stop. I cross-referenced my father's unit, Charlie Company, 3rd Battalion, 25th Infantry, Vietnam, 1973. Most reports for that year were routine patrols near Quang Tro Province, except one, a sudden radio blackout between March 12 and March 19. The same week my father disappeared behind enemy lines. The file was labeled Lost Recon, Unrecoverable, and the after-action report was only 2 pages long. One line stood out: civilians encountered during extraction, friendly fire incident denied. CPT. Lang returned with single survivor. I froze. Single survivor. That had to be the child from his letter, the one he said he promised to. SAVEI zoomed in on the signature at the bottom of the report. It was signed by Major Curtis Vaughn, my father's commanding officer. A quick search showed that Vaughn was still alive, 91 years old, living in a veteran care home outside Charleston. The next morning, I booked a flight. Charleston smelled like salt and rain the day I arrived. The care home sat on a quiet street lined with oak trees and fading American flags. Inside, the air was heavy with disinfectant and old memories. When I asked for Major Vaughn, the nurse looked me over, maybe recognizing the uniform under my coat, and led me to a small room near the end of the hall. He was sitting by the window, staring at a bird feeder like it was broadcasting from another world. His eyes were glassy, but when I said my name, Captain Lang's daughter, he turned slowly, and something flickered behind those clouded eyes. "You look like him," he rasped. I pulled out the photo from Dad's attic, the one with the burned-out village and the barefoot girl. "Major," I said quietly, "I need to know what happened during Operation Riverlight." He stared at the picture for a long time. His fingers trembled as he touched the edge. Then his jaw tightened, and he whispered, "You shouldn't have come here." "Please," I pressed. "My father left a letter. He said he kept a promise. He mentioned a child." He cut me off sharply. "You don't understand. None of us were supposed to." I leaned closer. "He hid his Medal of Honor, Major. He never told us why. I need to know what he was protecting." The old man's eyes filled with tears, but his voice hardened. "That medal wasn't for bravery. It was for silence." He looked out the window again, voice cracking. "There was no Operation Riverlight. It was cleanup. Something went wrong. Civilians caught in crossfire, women, children. Command wanted it gone. Lang disobeyed orders to save one of them, a girl. He carried her through enemy lines for days." My throat tightened. "He saved her." Vaughn nodded slowly. "He did, but he wasn't supposed to. They ordered us to erase the incident. They gave him the medal to shut him up, to rewrite what happened." I could feel the air leave the room. Why would he agree to that? He didn't answer for a long moment. Then, barely audible, he said, "Because they promised him she'd be safe if he stayed quiet." He looked at me then, straight through me. "You shouldn't be digging this up, Captain. That girl, she didn't stay in Vietnam. Lang brought her home. That's the promise he made." I felt my pulse pounding in my ears. "You mean he smuggled her out? How? Under whose name?" He looked terrified now, like he'd said too much. "It's all in the locker. He left it for her." "For who?" His eyes welled. "For you." I didn't understand what he meant until hours later, sitting in my rental car in the parking lot, replayed his words again and again. The locker. My father had a storage locker he'd kept for years in Richmond. one my mother always said was just old army junk. That night, I drove 3 hours straight to the facility. The attendant hesitated when I gave my father's name. That unit's been prepaid indefinitely, he said. Never opened since the day it was rented. You sure you're authorized? I slid my military ID across the counter. He was my father. The lock clicked open with a sound that felt like history, XHALING. Inside was nothing but a single metal footlocker on top, a tag, Langart. When I lifted the lid, the smell of old leather and humidity hit me. There were letters, photos, and a field log. Right on top, a small wooden box, the same kind as the one in my mother's attic. Inside it was a single envelope. My name was written on it, hands trembling. I tore it open. Inside, one page. Asterisk, if you're reading this, then the promise followed you home. What I did wasn't betrayal, it was redemption. The truth lies in her name. Find her, Dad. At the bottom, scrawled in ink, was a name I'd never seen before, Lin Tran. I sat there in the cold, under the flickering light of the storage bay, staring at that name. I whispered it aloud, Lin Tran, and something inside me shifted, because that name didn't belong in a war file. It belonged to someone, still, living, and whoever she was, she held the key to the promise that defined my father's life, and the lie my family was built on. The name Lin Tran haunted me. For days, it echoed like a whisper in my head, part memory, part ghost. I searched every military database, every veterans registry, even Vietnamese refugee archives. There were hundreds of Lin Tran-s, but only one connected to 1975. Lin Thi Tran, child evacuee, Operation Baby Lift. It was a small lead, buried deep in a humanitarian report, but the location next to it stopped me cold. San Jose, California. I'd been stationed near there once, years ago, never realizing that somewhere nearby, the secret my father died protecting might have been living quietly, under a name he gave her. So I packed my bag and flew west. San Jose was cool that morning, a thin mist rolling over the rooftops as I drove through the Vietnamese district. Flags hung above market stalls, old men played chess in parks, and the smell of coffee and grilled pork filled the air. It felt like a small world living inside a larger one, a place where history hadn't been forgotten, just rewritten in another language. I stopped at a small cultural center, hoping someone there might help me trace her. The woman at the desk, kind and patient, searched a registry on her computer and looked up after a moment. There's a Lin Tran who volunteers here sometimes, she said. She teaches English to older refugees. She glanced at me. Should I tell her someone's looking for her? I hesitated. How could I explain what I was looking for? That I was the daughter of a man who saved her, or perhaps ruined her life, 50 years ago. No, I said softly. I'll wait. She arrived an hour later, early50s.com, composed, carrying a small box of books. Her hair was streaked with gray, her eyes steady, kind but distant, the kind of eyes that had seen things too early. I watched her for a moment, heart pounding. When she looked up and our eyes met, I felt something indescribable, a spark of recognition, not memory, but something older, like the way my father used to look at me, the same warmth, the same quiet grief. Miss Tran, I managed, double quotes. Yes, her accent was faint, the kind that time softens but never erases. I took a breath. My name is Sarah Lang. My father was Captain Robert Lang. He served in Vietnam. Her face went still. Then she set the books down slowly, as if she'd just recognized the ghost. Asterisk, I knew that name would come back someday, she whispered. We sat in a small courtyard behind the center. The air smelled of rain and incense from a nearby shrine. She took a long moment before speaking. I was 8, she began. My village was near Quang Trop. Americans came often, sometimes to help, sometimes to fight. One night, there was gunfire. I remember hiding under my mother's arm. When it ended, I was alone. She looked away, her voice trembling. A soldier found me in the rubble. He carried me. I thought he was the enemy, but he kept saying, "You're safe now. You're safe." I didn't understand his words, but I understood his eyes. I swallowed hard. My father, she nodded. He called himself Lang. He wrapped me in his jacket. When helicopters came, he refused to leave me. His commander shouted, but he stayed. They fought over it. I remember the anger. He said something I never forgot. Her eyes glistened. If saving a child costs me my country, then so be it. I felt my throat tighten. That sounded exactly like him. The same moral fire that had burned through his entire life. She continued quietly. He got me on a plane, told me I would grow up safe. I never saw him again. I looked down at my hands. He brought you here, changed your name. Yes, she said. He told me to use the name Lin Tran. He said it would keep me hidden. Then she added, he sent letters. For years, I never answered. I thought maybe he'd been punished for what he did. I didn't want to cause him more trouble. She reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope, weathered, edges soft with age. It was my father's handwriting, to Lin. For every child war forgot, you are the promise I kept. I held it like it was made of glass. She smiled sadly. He saved my life, but he carried that guilt forever. He told me once he wasn't brave, just tired of obeying wrong orders. I laughed softly through tears. That sounds like him. She looked at me. Your father was a good man, but someone in your government didn't want that story told. They wanted a clean victory, not a rescue gone wrong. I nodded slowly. I think they rewrote it. Turned his disobedience into heroism, and his mercy into silence. For a long while, neither of us spoke. The city sounds faded behind the rustle of bamboo leaves. Then Lin asked, why now, after all these years? I looked up. Because he wanted me to find you. Because the world called him a hero for the wrong reason. She smiled, the kind that hurts more than it heals. He didn't save me to be remembered. He saved me so he could forget. That hit deeper than I expected. Because for the first time, I realized what my father's real war had been. Not the one fought in jungles, but the one he fought inside his own soul every day after. Before I left, Lin pressed something into my hand, a small silver cross, bent and scratched. He dropped this when he carried me. I kept it all these years. I recognized it instantly. I'd seen it once, in a photograph. The cross my father wore under his uniform. The one I thought was lost with his dog tags. He said it belonged to his daughter. She whispered, now it's yours again. I felt tears rise as I closed my fingers around it. For 50 years, a stranger had carried a piece of me, and a piece of him, halfway across the world. As I walked back to my car, I realized this wasn't just about uncovering the truth anymore. It was about restoring a promise, one that had crossed oceans, decades, and generations. But something still didn't fit. If Lin had lived quietly all these years, what was the lie my mother warned me about? And why did my father's medal, the one hidden away, bear a date after he was declared missing? I wasn't done digging. Not yet, because my father's ghost wasn't finished talking, and I could still hear him whisper, don't let them rewrite it. Honor, story style, first person, cinematic, emotional, 950 plus words. The night I opened that last envelope, I swear I heard my father's voice again, low, tired, and trembling with the weight of something he'd carried too long. The file lay spread across my kitchen table, dimly lit by a single lamp, pages whispering like ghosts whenever I breathed too close. And then I saw it. A single name scrawled across the top corner of a military incident report, Operation Quiet Dawn, civilians involved. Underneath, the coordinates matched that same village my father had been sent to liberate. But that wasn't what broke me. It was the note attached in my father's handwriting, edges frayed from years of folding and refolding. For the families who never got their truth, I tried to bring them home. My chest tightened. The air went cold, because that one line meant something unthinkable. My father, the man who wore his medals like shields, had been protecting someone else's shame. All my life, our family had been built around the story of his heroism. Every 4th of July, Mom would hang his medals by the window. People from the neighborhood would stop by, shake her hand, and say, your husband saved lives. I used to believe that with my whole heart, but the deeper I went into that file, the more that belief began to rot. Buried within the documents was a typed witness statement. It wasn't from an American officer, it was from a local interpreter, a man named Hassan Almiri, who had worked with my father's unit during the war. His account didn't sound like a victory, it sounded like a massacre. He described a dawn raid gone wrong, a tip that turned out false, a crossfire that left an entire family dead, a woman, her 2 sons, civilians. And he said one name again and again, Captain Robert Hayes. That was my father. I remember my hands shaking as I flipped through every page, my heart pounding so hard it made my vision blur. It was as if I was staring straight into a truth my family had painted over with ribbons and parades. My father hadn't just been haunted, he'd been hiding. I couldn't sleep that night. I sat in the dark, staring at his photo on the mantel, his smile frozen in that perfect army portrait, the flag draped behind him. I thought about Mom, how she'd always insisted that some things were better left in the past. And suddenly, her silence made sense. Maybe she'd known all along. Maybe the story of our hero wasn't built on courage, but on guilt. The next morning, I drove to my mother's house. She was sitting at the table, sipping coffee like nothing had changed. I placed the folder between us, the truth sitting like a live grenade. "Mom," I said quietly, "why didn't you ever tell me?" Her hands froze, her eyes didn't meet mine. When she finally spoke, her voice was so soft I barely heard her. "Because he made me promise." I felt my stomach twist. "Promise what?" "That we'd protect his name, that we'd protect you." I wanted to scream, but all I could do was whisper. "From what?" She finally looked up, and I saw tears pooling, the kind that come from years of carrying something heavy and unspoken. "From the kind of truth that destroys everything," she said. It turned out that after that mission went wrong, my father tried to report it, but higher command buried the event. Collateral misidentification, they called it. He was told that filing it officially would end his career, stain the unit, and make him the scapegoat. So he did what soldiers were trained to do. He followed orders, he lied, and then he lived with it. That's what the war really did to him. Not the bullets, not the explosions, the silence, the forced rewriting of truth. And in that silence, my family built our pride, one speech, one ceremony, one polished medal at a time. I remember stepping outside, my mother's confession still echoing in my ears. The cold air hit my face like a slap. Wasn't just a lie my father carried. It was a legacy. And suddenly I realized why he'd left that file behind, why he'd labeled it promise. He didn't want to be remembered as a hero, wanted to be remembered as human. The kind of man who made a mistake and couldn't forgive himself. That night, I sat on the porch, looking at the folded flag they'd handed us at his funeral, the same one I'd once thought represented honor and glory. Now it felt like a veil, covering up the truth beneath it. I whispered into the darkness, "Dad, was this your way of asking me to finish what you couldn't?" For the first time in years, I didn't feel angry at him. I felt responsible. Because if he'd been silenced by command, by duty, by shame, then it was my turn to speak. And if the world had built a lie around his name, then maybe I was the one meant to break it. That's when I knew what came next. I wasn't going to let his secret die buried in classified files. I was going to the one place he could never go back to. Village. The same place that broke him. The same place that held the truth he couldn't carry. I looked at the file one last time, and for the first time, I saw what he'd truly been fighting for. Not victory. Not medals. Just redemption. And maybe that's the kind of promise he'd meant for me to keep. Honor story style, first person, cinematic, emotional, 950 to 1,000 words. They say the battlefield never really leaves you, that it waits somewhere in the dust, breathing quietly until you come back. And the moment I stepped off that transport plane, I felt it, that old, invisible weight pressing on my chest. Same desert wind. Same heat that burns through your bones. Same silence that sounds too much like the past. Only this time, I wasn't here as a soldier on a mission, was here as a daughter chasing a ghost. The coordinates in my father's file led to a small village on the outskirts of an old conflict zone, a place wiped off every modern map, yet still scarred by what happened there decades ago. The locals called it Al Rahim, but on the report, it was just Sector Delta 49. I rode there in the back of an old truck, passing burned-out buildings and rusted tanks half swallowed by sand. Every mile brought the same question. What exactly had my father done here? When I arrived, there wasn't much left. A cluster of broken walls, a few palm trees bowing to the wind, and a well at the center filled with sand instead of water. But near that well stood a man. He must have been in his late 50s, wrapped in a white keffiyeh, his posture proud but his eyes hollow. "Hassan Almiri?" I asked. He turned slowly, studying me with suspicion. "Who's asking?" I hesitated before saying it. Captain Robert Hayes was my father. His expression changed. Not anger, not fear, just recognition. He led me to what used to be his home, a single room of stone and silence. The air inside smelled like earth and smoke, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same weight as the place itself. "I never thought I'd see one of his again," he said. "Your father came here when the world forgot this village." I sat quietly. "You knew him?" He nodded. He saved my life, but not my family's. I didn't know how to breathe after that. He poured tea into small cracked cups, the steam twisting like ghosts between us. He came back after the fighting, Hassan said, alone. No uniform, no gun. He buried the bodies himself, every one of them. He said he wanted them to have peace, even if he couldn't. My throat tightened. He never told anyone that. He couldn't, Hassan said. His commanders wanted the world to see victory, not tragedy. So they erased this place. He told me one thing before he left. I leaned forward. What did he say? Hassan looked out the broken window, his voice trembling. He said, "They'll give me medals for what I did right, but I'll carry the faces of what I did wrong." I felt tears sting my eyes. For years I thought those medals were symbols of pride. Now I realized they were markers of his pain. Little medal, reminders of the truth he could never speak. Hassan reached for a small box on a shelf and slid it across the table. Inside was a single photograph, faded and cracked, but still visible. My father stood in the center, no uniform, dirt on his hands, and a small girl beside him clutching his sleeve. That was my daughter, Hassan said quietly. She died that morning. He found her when it was over. He stayed with her until the end. I stared at the picture, my heart breaking for both of them. He came back 2 years later, Hassan continued. He tried to build a well here, sent supplies, but his government stopped the shipments. They said it was unauthorized. So this was his promise, the one that haunted him to his last breath. He couldn't save the living, so he tried to rebuild the dead. The sun began to set outside, painting the sand in crimson light. I stood at the edge of that old well, feeling the heat fade into the kind of cold that sinks into your bones. For the first time, I didn't see him as my father, the hero. I saw him as a man begging for forgiveness, and maybe that's why he left the file for me, not to expose him, but to finish what he started. I turned to Hassan. "There's something I can do," I said, something he wanted. He watched me closely. "And what is that?" "Tell your story," I said, "not just here, everywhere." His eyes softened. "You would do that?" "Yes," I whispered, "because silence buried him once. I won't let it bury you too." The next morning, I recorded everything. Hassan's testimony, the remains of the village, the graves marked by stones with no names. When I got back to the States, I took it to the Department of Veterans Affairs. Then 2 journalists who still cared about the truth. They called it a forgotten chapter of an old war. But for me, it wasn't history, it was home. Weeks later, I visited my father's grave. It was raining, the kind that feels like the sky is washing something clean. I laid the photo of him and the girl beside his headstone. "I found her, Dad," I whispered, "and I found what you couldn't say." The wind picked up, blowing against the flag that hung nearby. For a second, I imagined him standing there, not in his uniform, not a soldier, just a man who wanted to make things right. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel haunted by his secret. I felt at peace. Because in the end, I understood something he never got to say aloud. War doesn't end when the guns fall silent. It ends when the truth finally speaks. That was the reckoning, not vengeance, not shame, just truth. And sometimes, that's the bravest thing a soldier or their child can ever face. Honor story style. First person, cinematic, emotional, 950 to 1,000 words. They buried my father twice. Once in a coffin, and once under a story that wasn't true. It took me years to realize which burial hurt more. But standing there now, beneath an overcast American sky, I finally understood what he'd been trying to tell me all along, that honor isn't about the medals you wear, it's about the truth you face. And sometimes, facing that truth costs everything. A month after returning from Al Rihn, I was invited to speak at the National Veterans Memorial in D.C. The invitation came from the very department that once buried his report. They wanted me to share my father's story. The irony wasn't lost on me. I almost said, no, but then I thought of Hassan, of that girl in the photograph, her small hand clutching my father's sleeve, and I thought of the promise he made in that desert, for the families who never got their truth. I tried to bring them home. That was the promise I was keeping. The auditorium was filled with uniforms, soldiers, veterans, and the quiet hum of people who'd seen too much. As I stepped to the podium, the light hit my face. I saw my reflection in the glass, not the girl who once believed in fairy tales of heroism, but the woman who'd walked through the ashes of it. "My name is Captain Avery Hayes," I began, my voice steady. "I'm the daughter of Captain Robert Hayes. You know him as a decorated soldier. I knew him as a man who carried something far heavier than his medals. The truth. The room went silent. Even the air seemed to stop moving. I told them everything about the mission, the cover-up, the civilians who never got their names spoken again. And how my father spent the rest of his life trying to make it right. Some people looked shocked. Some looked angry. But one older officer, seated near the back, had tears in his eyes. He stood and saluted when I finished. And I swear, in that moment, I felt my father standing beside me, not the soldier, the man. After the speech, reporters swarmed, politicians made statements, and the news cycle turned it into something palatable, a daughter's quest for truth. But I didn't do it for headlines. I did it because truth, even when painful, sets you free. And that freedom, that was the one thing my father never got to feel. Weeks passed. The military formally amended the records of Operation Quiet Dawn. The deaths in Al Rahim were no longer collateral. They were recognized as civilians' innocent lives caught in the chaos of war. The army issued a statement of regret. They offered my family a public apology. None of that mattered as much as one simple message I got from Hassan. They built a new well, he wrote. The children drink from it now. We put your father's name on the stone beside it, not as a soldier, but as a man who kept his word. I stared at that message for a long time, and then I cried, not out of grief this time, but relief, because that was the closure he'd been waiting for. A month later, I went back to that same well, this time in person. The flight was long, the road even longer, but when I arrived, the desert didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt still, peaceful. Hassan was there, older, slower, but smiling. He pointed to the stone plaque near the base of the well. It read, "For those who carry the weight of what was lost, and for those who dared to make it right, in memory of Captain Robert Hayes, who kept his promise." I placed my hand on the stone, the sun warm against my skin. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the daughter of a war hero or the keeper of a secret. I felt like someone who had finally come home. That night, I sat beneath the stars. The same stars my father must have stared at decades ago, and I spoke softly into the desert air. "You can rest now, Dad." The truth made it home. The wind stirred the sand around the well, almost like it was answering, and I smiled, because I finally understood honor isn't about erasing mistakes, it's about having the courage to face them. When I returned to the States, I hung his medals back on the wall, but this time, I placed the declassified report beside them. Two sides of the same man, one forged by duty, the other by truth. People who visit my home often ask, "Was your father a hero?" And I always say the same thing. He was more than that. He was human. Final monologue. Closure voiceover for video ending tone. Cinematic slow build. My father taught me that sometimes the bravest battles aren't fought on foreign soil. They're fought in the quiet corners of your own conscience. And the strongest soldiers, they're the ones who can admit when they were wrong and still choose to make it right. His promise didn't die with him. It lived on, through the truth, and through me.